Hello everyone. Welcome to a brief video that introduces my idea on the relationship between history and cognitive psychology and neuroscience. This brief presentation was created and rehearsed for an audience of mostly cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists. So if this is an unfamiliar field for you, I don't necessarily recommend watching this video. However, if you are from this field, I actually do recommend this video over some of my longer videos that might bore you. This should provide a more direct and hopefully motivated introduction to my idea if you already work in cognition or have some familiarity as to the big questions that cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists are interested in. So when I say a relationship between history and cognitive neuroscience, the first thought that probably comes to your mind is, okay, this guy wants to talk about the history of cognitive neuroscience. Well, that's a super interesting topic, and I'm sure I will create a few videos on that. But I'm referring to a somewhat more fundamental idea, which is, can we consider a cognitive neuroscience of history? This is analogous to asking, can we consider a cognitive neuroscience of history in the same way that we have a cognitive neuroscience of perception, of memory, of navigation? The first thing I want to point out is that for most of us, this is going to strike as a somewhat bizarre proposition. There's something in this notion that seems absurd and I would say even impossible. And I want to take that seriously, and I'm going to explore why this seems bizarre in the very next slide. However, as scientists, we should all appreciate how it's one thing for an idea to be interesting. It's another thing for it to be testable. And of course, as scientists, we're interested in ideas that are testable, that are falsifiable. And so this leads me to somewhat of a concession/confession, which is, do I have a perfect experiment at this stage to test it? The answer is I don't. And I also would confess that, compared to cognitive problems like memory, navigation, this would be certainly much more difficult to, isolate and measure. Is it impossible to isolate and measure? I don't think so. And I'm going to sort of offer some solutions at the very end of this presentation. I would say that unlike, a broad topic like memory, thinking about history from a cognitive perspective might elucidate aspects of human cognition that are perhaps unique to humans, that make humans human. In that way, cognitive neuroscience of history is similar to a cognitive neuroscience of language, right? I would also say, and somewhat inspired by the work on consciousness, that just because we can't measure it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, doesn't mean that we can't talk about it. Of course, measuring and isolating and testing is a crucial part of what we do. And I would say that this neural correlate of historical thinking of history would be at least more falsifiable and testable than some neural correlate of consciousness, whatever that means, right? So the first thing is that this would be easier to define than a neural correlate of consciousness. So why does this proposition seem bizarre? Well, in the first place, I suggest that we consider how, as cognitive scientists, we're interested in intrinsic cognitive processes that are, themselves founded in fundamental problems like perception, memory, and navigation. We're interested in the intrinsic systems, not in the circumstantial objects of these systems, the circumstantial objects of cognition. Okay, so we might be interested in how the mind solves a perceptual problem of seeing apples, of memorizing apples, or navigating to an apple. The question then is history more like the apple, the circumstantial object of cognition, or in this figure, the gray arrow, the cognitive system, the problem? So I think we have to recognize that intuitively, history is certainly more like the apple. And why is that? Well, the apple exists physically, regardless of whether or not it's being perceived or being remembered, right? And so what is history? I think intuitively, history is that true objective record of past events. And that objective record is going to exist regardless of whether or not it's attached to a subjective mental process. Right? So from that, we might say that history is like the apple in the sense that it exists prior to the mind, prior to cognition. And I think this intuition is confirmed by our use of language, in English at least, because we can study history, we can think about history. And these verbs imply an agentic relationship between our cognition and a circumstantial object of cognition, in this case, history. Another related but perhaps distinct reason why this notion of considering a cognitive neuroscience of history just seems bizarre and impossible. And the fact is that ever since the cognitive revolution, we had this concept of cognitive modules as being in some sense native to the brain, being hardwired in neural machinery, and therefore being intrinsic to experience. I think a familiar argument related to this is the argument that language is in some sense native to the brain and intrinsic to experience. This is, of course, Chomsky's famous argument. And one of Chomsky's pieces of evidence was the existence of something called a universal grammar, that wherever you go on the planet, people are speaking languages that are fundamentally similar with regards to syntactical properties. So is there something like history that, just like the universal grammar, is a constant in human experience? I think we have to be honest here and recognize that intuitively our answer would have to be no, right? And so why is that? It's because this concept of history is relatively modern in some sense, right? So for the entirety of human existence, for as long as humans have been speaking languages, we certainly haven't had this concept of history, or we certainly haven't cared about this concept of history in the same way that we do now, right? So intuitively, prior to modernity, there's been other variants of world narratives, such as mythology, such as religious narratives, and intuitively these narratives are fundamentally different from what we call history, right? And that difference lies in the extent to which they're objective or view invariant. Intuitively, meaning is not the center point of history. We can extract meaning from history, but history is first and foremost a true record of things that have happened. But that seems opposite in mythology, where in mythology, meaning is the centerpiece of the narrative. So I would just reiterate that intuitively, there is no equivalent of the universal grammar for this concept of history, because history seems recent, modern, and non-universal. So I think at this point, we have to actually ask the question, what is history? We've been talking about it a lot indirectly, but let's finally try to define it. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, is this history, right? This collection of facts? Well, we seem to have social events, and there's a space-time context, right, for each event. That seems like a prerequisite for history. These facts are also true, right? They pertain to the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, something that really happened. And if you're American or Russian, you've probably learned about in history class. But I would say that in no minimal sense can we consider this to be history. So why is that? Well, we don't need more information. We don't need more events. What we need is a system for linking these events together. Okay, so what we need is some minimal sense of a timeline. And the timeline itself begs two questions. The first question is, what is a criteria for binding different events together? And the binding, of course, is represented here by the blue arrows. The second question is a little bit more fundamental. The question is, well, consider how the timeline is it's finite. It doesn't include the near infinitude of human events that have occurred in 1962, or when you consider the amount of human events that have occurred in the human past, it's basically incomprehensible. So what's the criteria for filtering events? What's the criteria for including some events and excluding others? At this junction, I would just point out how these questions are fundamentally cognitive, right? And these questions are furthermore implied by the very concept of history, insofar as history is understood to be a timeline. I'm going to offer my own explanations, my own answers to what might be going on behind these two questions. They're going to be somewhat like best guesses. I want to emphasize how even if you find my answers to be not so satisfactory, these questions might still be interesting. And above all, these questions are fundamentally cognitive. So we do need someone, I think, in the field who is exploring these questions. And so what do I think might be going on here from the perspective of cognition? Well, the first thing I'd point out is that this timeline bears a great deal of resemblance with episodic memory. Okay, so there's a space-time context that's attached to each event, and the time context is always unique, or almost always unique. And furthermore, these events are segmenting and binding time itself, right? So it's very similar to episodic memory in that sense. Of course, we don't think that this is episodic memory because we typically associate episodic memory as relating to the self and relating to the personal past. And it furthermore seems impossible for history, this timeline that's not experienced, to entail the sort of reinstantiation of experience, the sort of re-experiencing or mental time travel that's associated with episodic memory. It seems impossible because, I'm not Kennedy and I can still have this historical timeline in my head. So it seems impossible to think that I'm reliving, Kennedy announcing missiles and imposing a blockade on Cuba. It seems absurd, right? But I want to actually leave that as a little bit of an open question. The second thing that I think about is, well, look at the events and look at the linkages. There's a sort of causality that links each event with the other on the timeline. And there's not just a causality in a physical sense. These causal linkages implicate agents who themselves bear agency, bear the ability to induce causality in the universe. So when I think of these two things together, when I think of causality and agency, I think of theory of mind, and I'm going to turn to that right now. So when I say theory of mind, what comes to your mind? I think we've all been introduced to theory of mind through the classic Sally Ann task, right? In which we have an agent looking for a doll in one of two boxes, and the agent either has false or true information regarding the location or whereabouts of the doll. We understand that by the age of 4, infants are able to effectively predict which box the agent will look in based on the infant's knowledge of the agent's belief as to where the doll is, and also the agent's desire, the intention to sort of look for the doll. The other thing that's happened in recent years is that we've had a general appreciation for the extent and centrality of prediction in neural computations. So I think we can sort of beg the question, can we think of theory of mind as not just having to do with social cognition, but having to do broadly with prediction? Is theory of mind a general predictive model, a model in which we sort of make sense of causality, maybe even impose causality in the universe as human beings? One way we can ask this question is, we can go from representing agents with mental states to making predictions as to what actions they'll make. Do we do the reverse? Do we sort of observe causal outcomes in the universe and infer that those outcomes have been produced by agents with, beliefs and desires? Not just as infants, but, as adults. Do we do reverse theory of mind inference? This brief presentation will not cover important findings in theory of mind research. But at a minimum, I'm going to suggest that we do use this kind of reverse inference. And I'll suggest that this sort of inference is actually implicated, at least in the English language, in our reliance and use of the word why. And to illustrate this to you, I'm going to ask you a question, which is, why do neurons fire action potentials? Okay, so this seems like an inherently bizarre and absurd question. And that's because, I would suggest, the very asking of the word why assumes that neurons might be something like causal agents, and that we might be able to represent neurons' belief and desire states in their action of firing action potentials. And this seems bizarre and absurd because we know that, of course, neurons are biological units. Neurons aren't conscious, as far as I'm aware of, right? So I would just pose to you that, okay, well, that seems like a bizarre question, but I'm going to ask you a different question, which is, why did the Cuban Missile Crisis end peacefully? Okay, so for most people, like who aren't professional historians, this does not seem like a bizarre, absurd, or problematic question. For most people, this seems actually like a sort of manifest question that might give form to the very timeline that I showed previously. And that's sort of the point that I'm getting at here. Okay, so why did the Cuban Missile Crisis end peacefully? I'm going to suggest to you that this is a kind of implicit why question that gives form and animates any comprehensible sense of history as a timeline. All right, so the why question does two things. First and foremost, it assumes that an answer to the question itself lies in a chain of agentic causation, right? Agents doing things, agents reacting to things. And that chain of agentic causation is the very force that binds different events together on the timeline. Causal significance is also the criteria for event inclusion, right? So an event is included if it effectively answers the question, why did the Cuban Missile Crisis end peacefully? If it can be included within that causal chain. And on both fronts, I'm going to suggest to you that without the implicit why question, there's no comprehensible timeline that our minds can, seize upon. So this why question is something that comes from us as human beings. It does not come from the physical universe. At this minimal sense, history is not a property of the world. It's a property of our minds. Okay, so it seems like my presentation is being interrupted by a professional historian. And this historian is not happy with the claims that I made so far. She says that I'm totally misrepresenting what history is all about. She says that she is much more interested in asking complex how questions, not simple why questions. She says that she's less interested in upholding simplified narratives of the past, more interested in actually in deconstructing or critiquing the kind of timelines that people already have. And on both fronts, well, she's absolutely correct. Good academic history is not about using reverse theory of mind inference to deduce what happened in the past in a way that's minimally comprehensible to human minds. And so this leads me to an important point. The point is that we can draw a distinction between history as an object of study and history as a cognitive process. So I would suggest that this is essentially analogous to the distinction that we have in psychology between the sense of psychology as a discipline and folk psychology as another moniker for theory of mind, right? So folk psychology is a kind of reflexive model of psychology that people have because of our cognitive machinery, because of our social cognition. Does something analogous exist for history? Do our minds lead us reflexively to model the past as a timeline, which is itself founded on reverse theory of mind inference? So this might seem like an obvious distinction I'm making, but it hasn't really been made by anyone else so far. And there are some really important benefits from not just making the distinction, but really announcing it, explicating it. The first benefit that we get is sort of pragmatic, which is that we avoid the simplistic and I think silly conclusion that because commonsensical notions of history rely on theory of mind inference, therefore history itself must be inherently flawed or bad. Okay, so this is an argument that's actually made by someone. It's Alex Rosenthal, who wrote a book called How History Gets Things Wrong. And the point of the book essentially ends with this notion that, because history relies on theory of mind, therefore history is just always bound to get things wrong. And I argue in an article, which I'll link below, that this is not a good argument because historians really are not interested in why questions. Historians are much more interested in how questions. And not only are these how questions sophisticated, but they're also something of a moral obligation. So after something as terrible as the Holocaust, I argue that a moral obligation for historians to ask, how could this have possibly happened? Okay. And the second benefit of making this distinction is that not only do we avoid starting, I think, unnecessary fights with historians, but we can actually make alliances and learn from what historians have already discovered regarding the psychology of history as a mental experience. Okay, and there's a whole field within history called historiography, which refers to the construction of historical narratives. And historiography is filled chock-block with all sorts of revelations, mostly anecdotal, that pertain to this sort of mental construction. It's a fundamentally psychological problem, and in historiography, the mental construction is treated as somewhat of a problem, as a roadblock to objective history. So what I'm suggesting is that we consider, from a psychological perspective, what are those implicit connections that people make, between history, between the past, and between representations of the self, perhaps. And just returning really briefly to the Holocaust, I want to point out how this sort of psychological investigation could also benefit historians a great deal, okay? Because when we think about the Holocaust, one might also think about the kind of mythic narratives that are implicit in fascism, right? So having some sort of a psychological investigation of history as a mental construction, well, that mental construction appears time and time and again, within history itself. So this investigation could be mutually beneficial to psychologists and historians. And therefore, what I'm suggesting here is really an alliance between disciplines. Final benefit to asking this question or to making this distinction. The benefit is that we can explore seriously the phenomenology of history. More fundamentally, we can ask, is there a such thing as a phenomenology of history? Is this phenomenology consistent? Is it universal across human beings? In the next few slides, I will suggest that there is such a thing as a phenomenology of history, and it is, in many important ways, universal among human beings. And this is important because it helps to set up a kind of universal grammar, but for history. So in other words, it might lay the foundation for something like a cognitive neuroscience of history. I'm going to first ask you to consider a new concept. It's capital H history. It's like the kind of histories we've been considering previously, but capital H history implies a singularity. And it's implicit in sentences like, what does history tell us? She changed the course of history forever, or she really understands history. So what's implied in the word capital H history in all these sentences? Well, history, first and foremost, is a collection of information. It's social information, it's also space-time information, and they're all integrated together. Let's focus on the space-time part of this equation for a second. What do we know about space-time? Well, it's really hard to define a here without a there. It's quite difficult to define a now without a then. Space-time are experienced fundamentally in a relational way, right? And so that's also important for our understanding of the phenomenology of space-time. When you experience time, even a particular time, it's impossible to not also experience the larger context of time flowing. When you experience this particular place, it's impossible to not also experience the phenomenology of a larger world. Right? So I would suggest that at a pre-agentic level, at a level that is not up to our own volition or agency, space-time throws us into a sense of a larger context, of a sense of a larger world, and it orients the self within this larger world. Extending from that, consider the concept of capital H history. Might it be something like the world, not the physical world, but the social world? And just like the phenomenology of space-time, might our relationship with the social world be, in some sense, pre-agentic? It might not be the case that we think about history or we study history. Once again, this capital H concept. It might be the case that we are on history, that we ground ourselves in history. And at this point, I would ask you to consider something that should be a little unsettling. The point is that this assumption of meaning represents, more specifically, an implicit why question. when we're dealing with lowercase specific historical narratives, the why question doesn't seem so odd. It doesn't seem so odd to ask a question like, why did the Cuban Missile Crisis end peacefully? But with capital H history, we're not dealing with a specific problem. No, we're dealing with the totality of social space-time. So really, what I want you to consider is that this simplified schema of capital H history, there must be some sort of higher order why question that animates and scaffolds the schema itself. But what is it? Well, consider for a second the sentence, she changed the course of history forever. So we might consider whether this capital H history concept implies some sort of sense of meaning in the world, maybe even of the world. There's a kind of phenomenology of history as going somewhere, as if history was a person who had intent, as if we're applying theory of mind inference on history itself, as if, once again, history were a person. And this might seem like a sort of revelatory concept, but the thing is that historians understand this well. Historians understand that humans do this all the time. Historians even have a word for this. It's loosely referred to as telos, or the notion of teleological history. So the big point I'm trying to suggest here, or propose here, is that telos, the phenomenology of meaning of the social world, of capital H history, well, that might be a kind of universal constant. And therefore, following from the logic of the cognitive revolution, it might be something that we can explain from the perspective of cognitive neuroscientific modules, right? So I don't mean to imply that capital H history is itself a universal constant. Once again, capital H history might be a concept that's circumstantial to the English language and to the present day context. But I would just suggest that capital H history belies a meaning-centered approach to understanding the whole social world. And in previous times, and perhaps in different languages, this meaning-centered approach is naked in mythological or religious narratives. It's only in history where we sort of use the term history loosely, as if it were the true record of past things. But if there's one thing I want you to take away from this brief presentation, is that what makes history history is not the inclusion of true facts. No, it's the organizational binding of facts together and the inclusion of some facts and not other facts. And these processes are fundamentally determined by meaning-related concepts, not truth-related concepts. So finally, I'm going to recommend a very loose experimental protocol. It's incredibly loose, and I think I stated in the beginning of this presentation that testing this concept empirically is going to be difficult. But here I just want to at least begin thinking about how one can encounter the problem. So there's one thing I really want to test, which is the notion that the concept history implies a sort of schematic organization that people intuitively possess and that people will intuitively apply when confronted with the word history and when confronted with discrete historical facts. I'm also interested in the larger concept of telos, the totality of history itself. Is the totality of history going somewhere? Okay. So given these two constraints, I would do two things. I would first and foremost have an encoding phase at the beginning of an experiment, just asking participants to encode 10 or 15 historical facts. It's not really a memorization test, and I could sort of keep these facts present on screen. But I want there to be certain constraints regarding the facts themselves. I want there to be no obvious causal linkages between the facts. There's really no obvious causal linkage between fall of Roman Empire, the Crusades, and Columbus landing in America and Pearl Harbor. The other thing that we can observe from these facts is that they extend pretty much the totality of human experience, right? Going from the ancient era to the modern era. There's no single period or location. They're so expansive that any sort of schematization of these facts will probably have to tap into a higher level concept of capital H history. So the task is simply ask participants to freely narrate history, capital H history, to the best of their ability. I'm interested in whether subjects schematize events onto a unitized timeline. So do causal theory of mind linkages sort of emerge from the mere sparse cue to narrate history? All right. Do subjects reflexively provide these sort of causal linkages, even when they don't know that much about these historical events themselves, right? That's what I'm really interested in. Does the mere concept history sort of implicate a causal connection that subjects feel is manifest? And finally, I'm interested in phenomenology, right? So it's one thing for subjects to sort of narrate a historical narrative. Another question is, what does it feel like to recapitulate the narrative? Is there a feeling of telos? If there is such a thing as a neural correlate of movement, does that neural correlate emerge when a subject travels through history through a recapitulation of a historical narrative? And so finally, that is the end of my very brief and loose presentation. And here is, of course, a little cheeky link to Hegel. Those of you who have a historical background should be able to see the connection. And this is maybe something I can expand on in a later video.